I used to believe that death was final, that when someone you love is declared killed in action, they stay buried in your heart forever. I thought the flag folded into a perfect triangle and handed to my mother meant closure, meant we could grieve and eventually heal. I never imagined that 11 years later, my father would show up at my front door with a wedding ring on his finger and 2 children who called him Daddy. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and this is how my supposedly dead father destroyed 2 families in one devastating moment, and how my mother's reaction revealed a strength none of us knew existed. Before we dive into this story, tell me where you're watching from, and if you think you know how this ends, hit subscribe, because I promise you, nothing could have prepared any of us for what happened that Tuesday afternoon in October. Growing up in Cedar Falls, Iowa, felt like living in one of those Norman Rockwell paintings, all golden wheat fields stretching to the horizon, and neighbors who knew your name before you could walk. Our farmhouse sat on 40 acres that had been in my mother's family for 3 generations, with its wraparound porch painted cornflower blue and a tire swing hanging from the massive oak tree in the front yard. My father, Michael James Mitchell, everyone called him Mick, was the kind of man who commanded attention without trying. 6 feet tall with shoulders that seemed built for carrying the weight of the world, he had these deep green eyes that crinkled at the corners when he laughed, which was often. Dad worked the farm during planting and harvest seasons, but his real calling was the Army National Guard. He joined right out of high school, following in his father's footsteps, and by the time I was born, he was already a staff sergeant, with 15 years of service behind him. Mom, Rebecca Ann Cooper before she became a Mitchell, was everything soft. Where Dad was hard, everything gentle, where he was strong. She taught 2nd grade at Cedar Falls Elementary, the same school where she'd been a student herself 20 years earlier. Mom had this way of making every day feel special, turning ordinary Tuesday dinners into celebrations and finding magic in the smallest moments. Her laugh was like wind chimes in a summer breeze, musical and light, and she had a gift for making everyone around her feel like they were the most important person in the room. Our life revolved around predictable rhythms that felt as natural as breathing. Dad would wake before dawn, checking on the livestock and equipment before heading to whatever job site needed his attention that day. He worked construction during the off-season, building barns and grain silos for neighbors, his hands always stained with motor oil or concrete dust. Mom would be in the kitchen by 6, brewing coffee strong enough to wake the dead, and packing lunches with little notes tucked inside napkins, hearts drawn in permanent marker on brown paper bags. Breakfast was sacred in our house. Every morning, without fail, we'd sit at the round oak table that Dad's grandfather had made by hand, sharing stories about our plans for the day. Dad would read snippets from the farm report in the paper, Mom would tell us about her students' latest antics, and I'd complain about whatever homework assignment was making my life miserable that week. These weren't fancy meals, just scrambled eggs and toast most days, but they were ours, filled with the kind of comfortable conversation that only comes from people who genuinely enjoy each other's company. Sundays were for church, where Dad sang hymns in a bass voice that rumbled through the sanctuary and Mom played piano for the children's choir. After service, we'd drive to Grandma Cooper's house for dinner, a tradition that stretched back to before I was born. The entire extended family would gather around her massive dining room table, cousins and aunts and uncles crowding together, passing bowls of mashed potatoes and sharing gossip from around the county. Dad would sit at one end, quietly listening to the chatter, occasionally adding a dry comment that would send everyone into fits of laughter. The farm itself was modest by Iowa standards, but to me it felt like an entire universe. We had 40 heads of cattle, a flock of chickens that Mom treated like beloved pets, and a barn cat named Whiskers, who thought he owned the entire property. Dad taught me to drive the old John Deere tractor when I was 12, letting me help with haying and feeling tremendously important as I steered carefully between the windrows. Mom maintained a vegetable garden that could have fed half the county, rows of tomatoes and sweet corn and green beans that she canned every fall, lining the basement shelves with jars of summer preserved for winter meals. My bedroom was in the farmhouse's 2nd story, with windows that faced east toward the sunrise and west toward the sunset. Dad had painted it yellow when I was 7, saying it would be cheerful no matter what time of day it was, and Mom had sewn curtains from fabric covered in tiny sunflowers. My most prized possession was a wooden jewelry box that Dad had made in his workshop, carved with my initials and lined with purple velvet. Inside, I kept the usual treasures of childhood: friendship bracelets and movie ticket stubs, and a locket that had belonged to my great-grandmother. Evenings were for homework at the kitchen table while Mom graded papers and Dad worked on farm equipment in the garage. He was always fixing something, welding broken parts or rebuilding engines, the sound of his tools creating a comforting soundtrack to our domestic routine. When I finished my assignments, I'd often wander out to the garage, sitting on an overturned bucket and watching him work. Dad wasn't much of a talker, but he'd explain what he was doing as he worked, teaching me about hydraulics and electrical systems and the satisfaction of fixing something with your own hands. Friday nights meant high school football games, the entire community gathering at the stadium to cheer for the Cedar Falls Warriors. Dad never missed a game if he was in town, standing in the bleachers wearing his old Letterman jacket and shouting encouragement at players he'd known since they were toddlers. Mom would bring a thermos of hot chocolate and homemade cookies, sharing with anyone sitting nearby. These games weren't just entertainment, they were community gatherings where everyone caught up on news and celebrated together. Family vacations were simple affairs, usually camping trips to state parks within driving distance. Dad would load our ancient pop-up camper behind his pickup truck, and we'd spend long weekends hiking trails and roasting marshmallows over campfires. Mom would bring books and sketch pads, drawing pictures of wildflowers and birds while Dad taught me to fish or identify animal tracks. These trips weren't expensive or exotic, but they felt like adventures to me, special time when we existed outside the routine of farm work and school obligations. The only shadow over our perfect life was Dad's military service. Once a month, he'd report for National Guard duty, spending weekends at the armory or traveling to training exercises. I didn't think much about it when I was young. It was just part of Dad's routine, like church on Sunday or the evening news at 6 o'clock. But as I got older, especially after September 11th, I began to understand that his service might someday require more than weekend drills. The possibility of deployment lurked at the edges of our conversations, never discussed directly, but always present, like storm clouds gathering on a distant horizon. When I was 16, those storm clouds finally opened up. Dad received orders for a 15-month deployment to Afghanistan, his unit tasked with training Afghan military forces and providing security for reconstruction projects. The notification came on a Tuesday in March, delivered by his commanding officer who drove out to the farm personally. I remember watching from my bedroom window as Dad and the captain stood in our driveway talking, their conversation too distant to hear but their body language telling me everything I needed to know. That night, our family dynamics shifted in ways both subtle and profound. Dad became more intentional about everything, spending extra time teaching me to drive stick shift and showing Mom how to operate the farm equipment she'd never needed to understand before. He worked longer hours in his workshop, building cabinets and fixing things that hadn't been broken, as if he could complete every possible home improvement project before leaving. Mom threw herself into preparing, researching everything about Afghanistan and military deployments, filling binders with information about communication schedules and support services for military families. The deployment countdown became the rhythm of our lives, marking time in a way that felt both urgent and surreal. Dad had 60 days to prepare, 60 days to wrap up farm business and arrange for neighbors to help Mom with the heavier work while he was gone. Every conversation carried extra weight, every shared meal felt precious, and every mundane moment seemed to glow with significance because we knew it might be months before we experienced anything like it again. I was a junior in high school then, caught between childhood and adulthood in that awkward way that 16-year-olds navigate the world. My biggest concerns should have been prom dresses and college applications, but instead I found myself learning to operate irrigation systems and memorizing the phone numbers of every veterinarian within 50 miles. Dad insisted I needed to be Mom's backup for everything, the person she could rely on when machinery broke down or cattle needed medical attention. The responsibility felt enormous and terrifying, but also strangely empowering. He was trusting me with the farm, with Mom's safety, with everything that mattered most to him. Mom handled the preparation with characteristic grace, organizing everything with the efficiency of someone who'd spent years managing classroom chaos. She created detailed lists of important phone numbers, insurance information, and maintenance schedules for every piece of equipment on the property. The kitchen counter became mission control, covered with calendars marking Dad's training schedule and departure date, contact information for his unit, and time zone charts so we could figure out when to call him once he reached Afghanistan. She never cried where Dad or I could see her, but I sometimes heard her late at night, soft sobs drifting through the farmhouse walls. Dad's final weeks at home were a masterclass in saying goodbye without admitting that's what we were doing. He taught me to change oil in the truck and showed me where he kept the spare keys to every building on the property. We spent an entire Saturday replacing fence posts that didn't really need replacing, working side by side in comfortable silence while he shared stories about his own father and grandfather, men who'd worked this same land decades before. He told me about responsibility and integrity, about taking care of the people you love and the land that sustains you. These weren't dramatic speeches, just quiet conversations between fence posts, but they felt like the most important lessons I'd ever received. The farewell ceremony at the armory was everything I'd expected and nothing I was prepared for. Hundreds of families gathered in the gymnasium, soldiers in desert camouflage, standing at attention while their loved ones clustered nearby, children crying and wives trying to stay strong. The ceremony itself was formal and brief, speeches about duty and service and the importance of their mission. But the real moments happened in the parking lot afterward. Private goodbyes stretched out as long as possible before the buses arrived to take them to the airport. Dad hugged me for what felt like forever, his strong arms wrapped around me while I tried not to cry. He whispered that he was proud of me, that he trusted me to take care of Mom and the farm, that he'd be back before I knew it. When he finally let go, his eyes were bright with unshed tears, but his smile was genuine. He kissed Mom last, a long embrace that made me look away because it felt too private for observation. I watched through the bus windows as they drove away, Dad's face visible in one of the back seats, raising his hand in a final wave. The first few months of deployment passed more easily than I'd expected. Dad called every Tuesday and Friday evening when the time zones aligned properly, his voice crackling through static as he told us about the heat and dust, about the Afghan soldiers he was training and the progress they were making on various projects. He sounded tired but optimistic, describing a country that was beautiful and harsh in equal measure. Mom and I developed our own routine, managing the farm together while keeping up with school and work responsibilities. Our neighbors rallied around us in the way that rural communities do, checking in regularly and offering help with tasks that required more muscle than Mom and I could provide. I threw myself into my junior year with renewed focus, maintaining honor roll grades while playing varsity volleyball and participating in 4-H competitions. Mom encouraged my activities, understanding that staying busy helped both of us cope with Dad's absence. Friday night football games felt different without Dad in the stands, but Mom and I still attended every home game, maintaining traditions even when they felt incomplete. Our thermos of hot chocolate wasn't quite as large, and Mom's cheers weren't quite as loud, but we showed up because that's what Dad would have wanted. The farm work became our shared meditation, hours spent feeding cattle and maintaining equipment while we talked about everything and nothing. Mom revealed sides of herself I'd never seen before, telling stories about her childhood and her college years, about the dreams she'd had before she became a wife and mother. She wasn't bitter about the paths she hadn't taken, but she was honest about the choices she'd made and the compromises that come with building a life with someone you love. These conversations felt like gifts, glimpses into the woman my mother had been before I existed. Christmas that first year was strange and wonderful in equal measure. We'd sent Dad a box of homemade cookies and photos from around the farm, and he'd managed to call on Christmas morning despite the time difference. His voice sounded hollow through the overseas connection, but he was cheerful as he described his Christmas dinner of military rations heated over a camp stove. We opened presents without him, setting aside his gifts to wait for his return, but somehow the holiday still felt complete because we could feel his presence in every tradition we maintained. Spring brought renewed hope as Dad's tour entered its final months. His phone calls became more frequent, filled with excitement about coming home and plans for everything he wanted to do once he returned. He talked about expanding the cattle operation, maybe building a new barn, taking a family vacation to somewhere we'd never been before. Mom started planning a welcome home party, inviting neighbors and extended family to celebrate his safe return. I began counting days, marking them off on the calendar in my bedroom like a prisoner counting down to freedom. The last phone call came on a Tuesday evening in April, exactly 13 months into his deployment. Dad sounded tired but happy, describing a successful training exercise and mentioning that he'd received preliminary orders about redeployment schedules. He thought he'd be home by Memorial Day, just in time for planting season and my graduation ceremony. We talked for 20 minutes about ordinary things, farm business and school activities, and Mom's plans for the vegetable garden. He told us he loved us, just like he did at the end of every phone call, and promised to call again on Friday as usual. Friday came and went without a call. Mom wasn't immediately worried, since communication schedules sometimes shifted due to military operations or equipment problems. But when Tuesday arrived with no word from Dad, she called the Family Readiness Group, a network of military spouses who supported each other during deployments. They had no information but promised to make inquiries through official channels. By Thursday, Mom was calling the National Guard headquarters directly, demanding answers about why her husband hadn't contacted his family in over a week. The official notification came on a Saturday morning in May, delivered by Dad's commanding officer and a military chaplain who drove out to the farm in a government sedan. I was feeding chickens when I saw the car coming up our driveway, moving slowly as if the driver dreaded reaching his destination. Mom was in the garden, transplanting tomato seedlings into neat rows. The sight of the military vehicle brought all three of us together in our front yard, where time seemed to suspend itself as the officers approached with expressions that told us everything before they spoke a single word. Staff Sergeant Michael James Mitchell had been killed in action while conducting a routine patrol near Kandahar province. An improvised explosive device had detonated beneath his vehicle, killing him and 2 other soldiers instantly. His body would be returned home for burial with full military honors. The government would provide survivor benefits and support services. The nation was grateful for his sacrifice in service to freedom and democracy. The words washed over us like cold water, factual and final, and completely inadequate to contain the enormity of what they meant. The days following the notification blurred together in a haze of casseroles, flower arrangements, and well-meaning visitors who didn't know what to say but felt compelled to say something anyway. Our farmhouse, usually quiet except for the sounds of daily life, became a revolving door of neighbors, relatives, and church members bringing food we couldn't eat and offering comfort we couldn't accept. Mom moved through it all like a ghost, accepting condolences with gracious nods while her eyes remained fixed on some distant point none of us could see. The funeral planning consumed a week of our lives, decisions about everything from the casket to the flowers to the order of service at Cedar Falls Methodist Church. Dad's military service entitled him to burial at Arlington National Cemetery, but Mom insisted he belonged in the Cedar Falls Cemetery next to his parents and grandparents, surrounded by the Iowa soil he'd worked his entire life. The Army agreed to provide full military honors locally, with a flag-draped casket and a 21-gun salute that would echo across the prairie he'd called home. I found myself thrust into an adult role I wasn't prepared for, making decisions about details Mom couldn't handle, and serving as a buffer between our family and the outside world. People meant well, but their constant presence felt suffocating when all I wanted was space to grieve. Privately, Mrs. Henderson from down the road appointed herself our meal coordinator, ensuring someone brought dinner every night for 2 weeks. The high school guidance counselor called daily to check on my emotional state and offer resources for dealing with traumatic loss. Even distant relatives I barely remembered emerged from family trees to pay their respects and share memories of Dad I'd never heard before. The funeral itself was standing room only, with mourners spilling out of the church and onto the sidewalk. Dad's National Guard unit attended in dress uniforms, their presence adding solemnity to an already overwhelming ceremony. Pastor Williams delivered a sermon about service and sacrifice that somehow managed to capture Dad's quiet dignity without turning him into a saint. Mom sat in the front pew between me and Grandma Cooper, her back straight and her hands folded, accepting the flag from Dad's commanding officer with a composure that amazed everyone who witnessed it. The graveside service was smaller, limited to family and close friends who gathered around the freshly dug hole in ground that was still hard from winter frost. The honor guard performed their final salute with military precision, 7 soldiers firing 3 rounds each, while a bugler played taps from beneath the elm trees that shaded the oldest section of the cemetery. When they folded the flag and presented it to Mom, she held it against her chest like a shield, the red, white, and blue triangle containing whatever remained of the man who'd been her husband for 22 years. After everyone went home and the last casserole dish was returned to its owner, Mom and I were left alone with a silence that felt different from before. The farmhouse, which had always hummed with Dad's presence even when he was deployed, now felt cavernous and empty. His coffee cup still sat in the dish drainer where he'd left it before deployment. His work boots remained by the back door, caked with mud from the last job he'd completed before leaving. His reading glasses lay folded on the nightstand next to a biography of Ulysses Grant he'd never get to finish. We developed new routines born of necessity rather than comfort. Mom returned to teaching after 2 weeks, throwing herself into lesson plans and parent conferences with the same intensity she'd once reserved for managing our household. I finished my junior year with grades that reflected my emotional state rather than my academic ability, but my teachers understood and gave me grace I probably didn't deserve. The farm work continued because cattle don't stop needing food and water just because their owner has died, but every task felt mechanical, stripped of the purpose Dad's presence had given it. The summer stretched ahead of us like an obstacle course we had to navigate without a map. Mom hired Tommy Brennan, a local teenager, to help with the heavy work, but his eager attempts to fill Dad's boots only highlighted how impossible that task really was. Tommy meant well, arriving each morning ready to tackle whatever needed doing, but he didn't know the quirks of our equipment or the individual personalities of our cattle. More importantly, he wasn't Dad, and his presence felt like an admission that we were trying to replace the irreplaceable. Evenings were the hardest time. When the work was done and we had nothing left to distract us from Dad's absence, we'd sit on the front porch in the swing Dad had built from oak planks, watching the sun set over fields he'd planted but would never harvest. Sometimes we talked about him, sharing memories that felt both precious and painful. Other times we sat in comfortable silence, listening to the sounds of rural evening, cicadas and cattle, and the distant rumble of trains carrying grain to market. Mom's grief manifested differently than mine, more controlled but somehow deeper, like a well that had no bottom. She maintained her routines with mechanical precision, teaching her classes and attending church and managing household tasks, but something essential had gone out of her. The woman who used to hum while folding laundry and find magic in ordinary moments had been replaced by someone going through the motions of living without actually being alive. She still laughed occasionally, but the sound was hollow, an echo of joy rather than joy itself. I threw myself into work that summer, taking a job at the local grain elevator and helping with harvest crews when neighbors needed extra hands. Physical labor felt good, pushing my body hard enough that I fell into bed exhausted each night without time to think about everything we'd lost. The older farmers I worked with had known Dad since he was my age, and they shared stories about his character and work ethic that helped me understand the man he'd been before I was born. These men didn't offer empty platitudes about God's plan or everything happening for a reason. They just worked alongside me and occasionally mentioned something Dad had done or said that had impressed them, gifts of memory that meant more than any formal condolence. The church became complicated in ways I hadn't expected. Pastor Williams meant well, but his sermons about finding meaning in suffering and trusting God's greater plan felt inadequate against the reality of Dad's absence. The congregation rallied around us with genuine love and support, but their assumption that faith would somehow make our grief easier to bear felt like pressure to perform emotions I didn't feel. I wanted to rage against the unfairness of losing Dad when he'd been doing exactly what everyone said was noble and right. I wanted to question why good men died in foreign countries while other people lived long, comfortable lives without ever sacrificing anything for anyone. These weren't the kinds of doubts that fit easily into Sunday morning worship services. Fall brought my senior year and the strange experience of navigating milestones Dad would never witness. College applications felt simultaneously crucial and pointless, planning for a future that seemed impossible to envision without him there to offer advice and encouragement. Mom pushed me to apply to schools I'd always dreamed of attending, insisting that Dad would want me to pursue every opportunity available. But the thought of leaving her alone on the farm felt like abandonment, adding another layer of guilt to an already complicated emotional landscape. The first anniversary of Dad's death approached like a storm we could see coming but couldn't avoid. Mom and I made plans to visit his grave and perhaps have a small memorial service at church, but mostly we tried not to think about how much time had passed since we'd heard his voice or felt his presence in our daily lives. A year felt both like forever and like no time at all, long enough for some of the sharp edges of grief to soften but not nearly long enough to accept that he was really gone forever. That's when the letter arrived from the Department of Defense, delivered on a Tuesday afternoon in April, exactly 1 year after Dad's last phone call home. Mom was in the garden again, planting the same variety of tomatoes she'd been transplanting when the notification officers had come to tell us Dad was dead. I brought the mail in from the box at the end of our driveway, sorting through bills and advertisements until I found the official envelope with its military return address and formal weight that suggested important contents. The letter sat unopened on our kitchen table for 3 hours while Mom and I stared at it like it might explode. Official correspondence from the Department of Defense had taken on an ominous quality in our household, carrying the potential to deliver news we weren't prepared to receive. The envelope was thick, suggesting multiple pages of information, and bore the seal of the Army Human Resources Command. Mom's hands trembled slightly as she finally picked it up, using Dad's old letter opener to slice through the heavy paper. The contents were routine administrative documents, mostly forms related to survivor benefits, and final accounting of Dad's military service record. But buried in the stack of papers was a single sheet that made Mom sink into her chair, as if someone had knocked the wind out of her. It was a casualty report addendum, an update to Dad's official death record that had been classified until recently. The document was filled with military jargon and bureaucratic language, but the essential information was clear enough to understand, even through the formal terminology. Dad's patrol had been responding to reports of suspicious activity near a remote outpost when their convoy encountered the improvised explosive device. However, new intelligence gathered from captured insurgents revealed that Dad had survived the initial blast. He'd been thrown clear of the vehicle, suffering severe injuries, but remaining conscious long enough to provide covering fire for his teammates. Witness statements indicated he'd lived for approximately 20 minutes after the explosion, using his final moments to coordinate the evacuation of wounded soldiers and relay tactical information to incoming rescue units. The report included testimony from Sergeant First Class James Rodriguez, who'd been part of the quick reaction force that responded to the attack. Rodriguez described finding Dad partially conscious beneath an overturned Humvee, his legs trapped but his mind clear enough to give coherent instructions about enemy positions and wounded personnel. Dad's final words, according to Rodriguez's statement, were instructions to tell his family he loved them and that he'd tried his best to come home. He'd died while being loaded onto a medical evacuation helicopter, his heart stopping just as the aircraft lifted off from the landing zone. Mom read the report 3 times before setting it down with hands that shook uncontrollably. For an entire year, we'd lived with the official version of Dad's death, told that he'd been killed instantly and hadn't suffered. Learning that he'd actually survived long enough to think about us, to send us a final message, to experience the terror and pain of dying slowly in a foreign desert, shattered the fragile peace we'd built around his memory. The knowledge felt like losing him all over again, but worse, because now we knew he'd spent his final moments hoping for rescue that came too late. The updated report also contained information about Dad's personal effects, items that had been recovered from the blast site, but held as evidence during the investigation into the attack. A small box arrived 2 days later, containing things that had somehow survived the explosion that killed him. His wedding ring, scratched and dented, but still recognizable. A photo of Mom and me that he'd carried in his wallet, now stained with desert sand and something darker that we tried not to identify. A small notebook where he'd written letters he'd planned to send home. Pages of thoughts and observations about Afghanistan, and messages for us that we were never supposed to read under these circumstances. Reading Dad's unfinished letters felt like eavesdropping on conversations with a ghost. He'd written about missing the smell of Iowa soil after rain, about wondering whether the corn he'd planted before deployment had grown tall, about hoping to be home in time for my graduation ceremony. One entry described a dream he'd had about teaching me to drive the new tractor he'd been planning to buy, a piece of equipment we'd discussed during his last phone call home. Another talked about his plans for expanding the cattle operation, and his excitement about working the farm alongside me as an adult partner rather than just his little girl. The most devastating entry was dated just 3 days before his death, a letter addressed to Mom that he'd apparently been writing over several weeks. In it, he expressed concerns about his unit's recent missions, noting increased insurgent activity and his growing anxiety about the safety of his soldiers. He wrote about feeling responsible for the younger men under his command, boys barely older than me who looked to him for guidance and protection. The letter revealed fears he'd never shared during our phone calls, worries about whether he was making the right tactical decisions, and whether his experience was adequate to keep his people alive. But the letter also contained expressions of love so raw and honest, they felt too private for anyone else to read. Dad wrote about missing the sound of Mom's laughter, about dreaming of holding her hand while sitting on our front porch swing. He described counting days until he could help her with the garden again, until he could fix the squeaky hinge on the barn door that had been annoying him for months before deployment. He wrote about wanting to grow old with her, about imagining retirement years spent traveling to places they'd always talked about visiting but never had time to see. The final paragraph of the unfinished letter contained Dad's instructions for Mom in case something happened to him. He wanted her to know that serving his country had been an honor, that he'd never regretted the choices that led him to Afghanistan. But he also wanted her to promise that she wouldn't let his death define the rest of her life. He wrote about wanting her to find happiness again, to consider remarrying if she met someone who could love her the way she deserved. The generosity of that sentiment, his concern for her future even while facing his own mortality, broke something in Mom that took weeks to begin healing. Processing this new information about Dad's death changed everything about how we remembered him and how we grieved his loss. The clean narrative we'd constructed around his sacrifice became complicated by knowledge of his suffering, his fear, his very human concerns about the decisions he'd made in his final weeks. The heroic figure who'd died instantly while serving his country was replaced by a more complex person who'd faced death with courage but also with regret about everything he was leaving behind. Mom's response to the updated casualty report surprised me with its intensity. Rather than deepening her grief, the new information seemed to energize her in ways I hadn't seen since before Dad's deployment. She began researching everything she could find about his unit's activities in Afghanistan, reading news reports and military blogs, and connecting with other families who'd lost soldiers in similar circumstances. She started attending meetings of military family support groups, becoming an advocate for better communication between the Pentagon and surviving relatives. The woman who'd spent a year moving through life like a sleepwalker suddenly had purpose again, driven by anger at the military bureaucracy that had kept crucial information from us, and determination to prevent other families from experiencing the same delayed revelations about their loved ones' deaths. Mom wrote letters to congressmen and senators, demanding accountability for the delays in releasing complete casualty reports. She organized other military widows to lobby for transparency in how the Department of Defense communicates with families of fallen soldiers. This new activism brought Mom into contact with people and organizations she'd never encountered during our quiet rural life. She began traveling to Washington for meetings with legislative staff, speaking at conferences about military family issues, and consulting with legal advocates who worked on veterans affairs. The farm, which had been our entire world before Dad's deployment, became just one part of a larger mission to honor his memory by fighting for other military families. My senior year passed in a blur of college applications and scholarship interviews, activities that felt both crucial and surreal given everything our family had experienced. Mom pushed me to pursue opportunities at universities far from Iowa, insisting that Dad would want me to experience life beyond the boundaries of our rural community. But part of me felt guilty about the prospect of leaving her alone with the farm and her newfound advocacy work, even though she assured me repeatedly that she wanted nothing more than to see me succeed. The letter that arrived in March of my senior year, just days before my 18th birthday, carried a return address I didn't recognize, but handwriting that made my heart stop beating for several long seconds. The envelope was addressed to Rebecca Mitchell in careful block letters that looked familiar, but impossible, written by someone who knew Mom's full name but shouldn't have had any reason to contact her. When Mom opened it at our kitchen table, The color drained from her face so completely I thought she might faint. The letter was written on plain white paper, the kind you could buy at any office supply store, but the handwriting was unmistakably Dad's. Not the careful script he used for important documents, but the hurried scrawl he'd developed during years of taking notes in the field, letters slanted, and words occasionally running together when his thoughts moved faster than his pen. Mom stared at the page for what felt like an eternity before her hands began shaking so violently she had to set it down on the table between us. "Rebecca," the letter began, "I know this will come as a shock, and I know I have no right to contact you after all this time, but I need you to know that I'm alive, and I need to explain what happened in Afghanistan, why I couldn't come home, why I let you and Sarah believe I was dead. There's no excuse for what I've done, but there are reasons, and you deserve to know the truth, even if you can never forgive me." The words swam on the page as I tried to process their meaning. Dad was alive, had been alive all this time while Mom and I grieved his death, while we struggled to rebuild our lives around his absence, while we learned to exist in a world that no longer included him. The impossibility of it made my brain refuse to accept what my eyes were seeing. Some part of me insisting this had to be a cruel joke or a case of mistaken identity, or anything other than what it appeared to be. Mom made a sound like air being forcibly expelled from her lungs, a gasp that contained 2 years of accumulated grief suddenly transformed into something else entirely. She picked up the letter again with hands that trembled, reading silently while I sat frozen in my chair, watching her face cycle through emotions I couldn't identify. Shock gave way to confusion, then to something that looked like anger, then to an expression of pain so raw it was difficult to witness. "He was captured," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The explosion injured him, but he wasn't killed. He was taken prisoner by insurgents who found him before the rescue team did. They held him for 8 months in caves somewhere near the Pakistan border. He says the military listed him as killed in action because they found his dog tags and blood at the blast site, and they had no evidence he'd survived." The explanation felt both completely plausible and utterly surreal. We knew that soldiers sometimes survived being listed as casualties, that the fog of war created confusion about who lived and who died. But this was Dad, our dad, who we'd buried in absentia while he was actually alive somewhere in Afghanistan, probably wondering why no rescue mission ever came for him. The magnitude of the miscommunication, the bureaucratic failure that had separated our family for nearly 2 years, was staggering. "He escaped," Mom continued, her voice growing stronger as she worked through the letter. "Made it to a coalition base in Pakistan where they could verify his identity. But by then, he'd been officially dead for over a year. The military offered to arrange his return to the United States, to help him reconnect with his family. But he—" She stopped reading, her jaw clenching as she processed whatever came next. "But what?" I demanded, my own emotions starting to catch up with the situation. Relief that Dad was alive warred with anger that he'd let us believe otherwise. Confusion about why he hadn't come home immediately mixed with fear about what his letter might reveal about the man we'd thought we knew. Mom's voice cracked as she continued reading aloud. "He says he was different when he escaped. That 8 months of captivity had changed him in ways he couldn't explain. That he was suffering from what the doctors called severe post-traumatic stress disorder. He was having nightmares, panic attacks, episodes where he couldn't remember where he was or what year it was. The military wanted to hospitalize him for treatment, but he was afraid of coming home broken, afraid of disappointing us when we'd already grieved and moved on with our lives." The reasoning felt simultaneously understandable and infuriating. Dad had always been proud, the kind of man who fixed problems himself rather than asking for help. The idea that he might return home as something less than the strong, capable person we remembered would have been devastating to someone with his sense of responsibility and self-reliance. But the arrogance of making that decision for us, of assuming we'd prefer his death to his imperfection, made me angrier than I'd ever been in my life. "There's more," Mom said, her voice taking on a quality I'd never heard before, flat and mechanical as if she were reading a grocery list instead of the most important letter she'd ever received. "He didn't come home because by the time he was physically and mentally capable of making the trip, he'd been declared dead for so long that returning seemed impossible. He says he didn't know how to explain his survival to us, didn't know how to come back from the dead without destroying whatever piece we'd found." The letter detailed Dad's life in the 2 years since his escape, a story that sounded like something from a movie rather than reality. He'd remained in Pakistan initially, working with relief organizations while receiving treatment for his psychological injuries. When he felt strong enough to travel, he'd made his way to Australia rather than coming home, using forged documents to enter the country and begin building a new identity. He'd found work on cattle stations in the outback, using skills he'd learned on our Iowa farm to earn a living in a place where no one knew his real name or asked questions about his past. The most devastating revelation came near the end of the letter, buried in a paragraph that Mom read silently before looking up at me with eyes that held a mixture of pain and something that might have been relief. "He's married," she said simply. "He married an Australian woman named Catherine, and they have a daughter together. Her name is Emily, and she's 6 months old." The information hit me like a physical blow, knocking the breath from my lungs and making the room spin around me. Dad wasn't just alive, he'd built an entirely new life with people who'd never known he had a family in Iowa. While Mom and I had been learning to live without him, he'd been falling in love with someone else, creating new memories and new traditions and new reasons to stay away from us. The betrayal felt complete and devastating, worse than his death had been because at least death was final and not chosen. Mom set the letter down and walked to the kitchen window, staring out at the farm Dad had worked his entire adult life, the land he'd apparently found easy to abandon when it became inconvenient to return to. Her shoulders were rigid with tension, her breathing shallow and controlled in a way that suggested she was fighting to maintain composure. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but carried an undertone of something dangerous. "He wants to see us," she said without turning around. "He's planning to visit the United States next month on business, something about importing cattle genetics for his Australian operation. He'll be in Chicago for a week, and he's hoping we might be willing to meet with him. He says he understands if we refuse, that he has no right to ask anything of us after what he's put us through." The audacity of the request was breathtaking. Dad wanted to schedule a reunion like we were old friends who'd lost touch, as if 2 years of believing him dead was just an unfortunate misunderstanding that could be cleared up over coffee and conversation. He'd built a new life with a new wife and new child, but he still wanted access to his old family when it was convenient for him. The selfishness of it made me want to scream. "Are you going to see him?" I asked, though I was afraid of the answer either way. Part of me desperately wanted to see Dad again, to confirm that he was really alive and to demand explanations for everything he'd put us through. But another part of me was terrified of what that meeting might reveal about the man I'd idealized in death, afraid that seeing him would destroy whatever positive memories I still carried. Mom turned from the window to face me, and I was surprised by the hardness in her expression. The woman who'd spent 2 years grieving Dad's loss with dignity and grace had been replaced by someone I barely recognized, someone capable of emotions I'd never seen her display. When she spoke, her voice carried a cold fury that made me understand why people sometimes talked about the wrath of quiet women pushed too far. "Oh yes," she said, and her smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "I'm absolutely going to see him. There are some things Michael needs to hear from me in person." Mom's transformation in the days following Dad's letter was both fascinating and terrifying to witness. The woman who had spent 2 years moving through grief with gentle resignation suddenly possessed a focused intensity that reminded me of a predator stalking prey. She went about her daily routines with mechanical precision, teaching her second-grade classes and managing farm chores, but underneath her calm exterior, something was building pressure like water behind a dam that was about to burst. She responded to Dad's letter within 24 hours, her reply brief and businesslike in a way that would have seemed polite to anyone who didn't know her well. She agreed to meet him in Chicago, suggesting a specific hotel restaurant that was public enough to prevent any dramatic scenes, but private enough for the conversation they needed to have. She included our phone number and asked him to call when he arrived in the city so they could confirm the details. The letter was signed Rebecca Mitchell, using her married name with deliberate emphasis, and contained no expressions of forgiveness, understanding, or even acknowledgement that she was happy he was alive. I begged her to let me come along, arguing that I had just as much right to confront Dad as she did, that I deserved answers about why he'd chosen to abandon us rather than come home damaged. But Mom was adamant that this first meeting needed to happen between her and Dad alone, that there were things they needed to discuss without me present. She promised I could see him afterward if I still wanted to, but she insisted on handling the initial confrontation herself. The steel in her voice when she made this decision told me that arguing would be futile. The week before Dad's call was scheduled to arrive passed with agonizing slowness. Mom continued her normal activities, but with an undercurrent of preparation that reminded me of how she'd organized our lives around Dad's deployment. She had her hair cut and styled at the salon in town, bought a new dress that was elegant but severe, and spent hours at her computer researching everything she could find about Dad's new life in Australia. Somehow she'd managed to locate information about his wife Catherine, his job managing a cattle station in Queensland, even photos from social media accounts that showed him looking healthy and content in his new role as husband and father. The pictures were devastating to look at. Images of Dad holding a baby girl who had his green eyes and stubborn chin, standing next to a blonde woman who smiled at him, with the kind of comfortable affection that spoke of genuine partnership. He looked older than I remembered, his hair more gray and his face marked by experiences we'd never shared, but he also looked happy in a way that made my chest ache with complicated emotions. This was the life he'd chosen instead of coming home to us, the family he'd built while we grieved his supposed death. When Dad's call finally came on a Tuesday evening, I answered the phone before Mom could reach it, desperate to hear his voice even though I had no idea what I would say to him. The sound of his familiar "Hello, Sarah" made my knees weak, the same tone he'd used during deployment calls but carrying new weight now that I knew he'd chosen to stay away. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence filled with 2 years of accumulated grief and anger and questions that had no good answers. "Dad?" I whispered, still unable to fully believe he was real, that this conversation was actually happening. Part of me expected him to reveal himself as an imposter, someone who'd stolen Dad's voice and identity for reasons I couldn't imagine. But when he responded, using my childhood nickname and referencing details only he would know, the reality of his survival became impossible to deny. "Hi, sweetheart," he said, and I could hear tears in his voice. "I know this is. I know I have no right to call you that anymore. I know what I've done is unforgivable, but I needed to hear your voice, needed to know you're okay." The conversation was awkward and painful, filled with statements that started and stopped, emotions too complex to express in words. He asked about school, about the farm, about Mom's health, ordinary questions that felt surreal given the circumstances of our separation. When Mom took the phone from me, her transformation was immediate and complete. The warm, caring person I'd known my entire life disappeared, replaced by someone who spoke with the cold professionalism of a business transaction. She confirmed the meeting details with Dad, discussed logistics like parking and timing, and ended the call without saying goodbye, or expressing any sentiment that might be construed as affection. After hanging up, she sat at the kitchen table for a long time, staring at the spot where Dad's letter had first shattered our understanding of reality. The drive to Chicago took 3 hours, time Mom spent in almost complete silence, except for occasional comments about traffic or weather. I'd convinced her to let me come along for the trip, though I would wait in the hotel lobby while she met with Dad in the restaurant. The compromise felt inadequate, but it was better than staying home and imagining the conversation, rather than witnessing its aftermath firsthand. Mom had dressed carefully for the occasion, choosing clothing that emphasized her dignity and strength rather than her grief or vulnerability. The hotel was one of those upscale downtown establishments that catered to business travelers, all marble lobbies and crystal chandeliers designed to project success and sophistication. Mom checked her appearance in the bathroom mirror one final time, adjusting her necklace and smoothing her hair with the careful attention of someone preparing for battle. When she kissed my forehead before walking toward the restaurant, her lips were cold, despite the warmth of the lobby. I positioned myself in a chair that offered a clear view of the restaurant entrance, pretending to read a magazine while watching for Dad's arrival. When he appeared, walking through the lobby doors at exactly the appointed time, my breath caught in my throat. He looked like Dad but different, older, and somehow smaller than I remembered, his shoulders carrying a weight that hadn't been there before his deployment. He wore a suit that looked expensive but unfamiliar, the kind of formal clothing he'd never needed during his life as an Iowa farmer. Dad paused outside the restaurant, straightening his tie and running a hand through his graying hair before walking inside to meet his fate. From my position in the lobby, I couldn't see the moment when he and Mom first laid eyes on each other after 2 years of believing they'd never meet again. But I could imagine the shock of recognition, the awkwardness of greeting someone who was simultaneously the most familiar and most foreign person in their respective worlds. The meeting lasted exactly 90 minutes, long enough for appetizers and entrees but not dessert, long enough for explanations but not forgiveness. I watched the restaurant entrance like a sentry, noting the arrival and departure of other diners, the rhythm of service staff moving between tables, the ordinary life of the hotel continuing around the extraordinary drama unfolding behind closed doors. Several times, I was tempted to abandon my post and try to eavesdrop on their conversation, but respect for Mom's explicit instructions kept me planted in my chair. When Mom finally emerged from the restaurant, her composure was intact, but her eyes held a brightness that suggested barely contained emotion. She walked directly to where I was sitting without looking back, her movements deliberate and controlled. Dad followed several minutes later, his face pale and his expression shell-shocked, like someone who'd just survived a natural disaster. He glanced around the lobby as if looking for me, but Mom had already ushered me toward the exit before he could approach. We drove home in silence, even more complete than our morning journey, Mom's hands gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity while she stared at the highway ahead. The radio remained off, leaving us alone with the sound of tires on asphalt and our own racing thoughts. I wanted desperately to ask what had happened, what Dad had said, how Mom was feeling, but something about her posture warned me that questions would not be welcome until she was ready to provide answers. It wasn't until we were back in our own kitchen, surrounded by the familiar comfort of home, that Mom finally spoke about her reunion with the man she'd buried 2 years earlier. Her words, when they came, were measured and precise, delivered with the kind of careful control that suggested she'd been rehearsing them during our silent drive across Iowa farmland. "Your father," she said, and the emphasis on the word father carried implications I was only beginning to understand, "has some very interesting things to tell us about his new life. It seems there are details in his letter that don't quite match the reality of his situation. Details that make his choices considerably more difficult to forgive than even I had imagined." Mom poured herself a cup of coffee that had been sitting on the warmer since morning, the liquid thick and bitter from hours of neglect, but she drank it anyway, as if she needed the caffeine to fuel what she was about to tell me. She sat across from me at our kitchen table, the same spot where she'd read Dad's letter a week earlier, and for the first time since his resurrection, she looked every one of her 45 years. The composed mask she'd worn to Chicago had slipped, revealing exhaustion that went deeper than physical tiredness. "The timeline in his letter was carefully constructed," she began, her voice carrying the analytical tone she used when grading particularly complex math problems for her students. "He presented his story in a way that made his choices seem inevitable, almost noble in their self-sacrifice. But when pressed for details, when asked specific questions about dates and circumstances, a very different picture emerged." She wrapped her hands around the coffee mug as if drawing warmth from its surface, though the kitchen was comfortable, and her trembling seemed to come from something other than cold. "Your father wasn't captured immediately after the explosions, Sarah. He was found by coalition forces within 6 hours, conscious and coherent enough to give them his name and unit information. He was evacuated to a field hospital in Kandahar, then transferred to a military medical facility in Germany for treatment of his injuries." The revelation hit me like cold water, washing away the narrative I'd constructed around Dad's survival. Instead of the heroic prisoner of war who'd endured months of captivity, he became something else entirely, someone whose choices were driven by factors more complicated than the simple story he'd presented in his letter. "So he was never actually captured?" I asked, though I was beginning to understand that the truth was more nuanced than a simple yes or no answer. "Oh, he was captured," Mom said, her smile sharp enough to cut. "But not by insurgents. He was captured by his own fear, his own inability to face the consequences of coming home damaged. The military doctors diagnosed him with severe traumatic brain injury and post-traumatic stress disorder. He was experiencing memory gaps, panic attacks, episodes of disorientation that made him feel like a stranger to himself. The psychological evaluation recommended extensive treatment and a gradual reintegration program designed to help him reconnect with his family. She took another sip of the bitter coffee, her expression suggesting she was tasting something far more unpleasant than overbrewed beans. Your father was presented with options. He could enter a treatment program in Germany and work toward eventual return to active duty. Or he could accept medical retirement and begin the process of coming home to us. Either path would have involved months of therapy, medication, and the hard work of rebuilding his sense of self after trauma. The kitchen felt smaller suddenly, as if the walls were closing in around us while Mom revealed the extent of Dad's deception. But he chose a third option, she continued, her voice growing harder with each word. He chose to disappear. While the doctors were developing his treatment plan, while the military was processing his medical retirement paperwork, while we were grieving his supposed death, your father walked away from the hospital in Germany and simply vanished. The image of Dad abandoning medical treatment to avoid the difficult work of recovery painted him in a light I'd never seen before. This wasn't the heroic soldier who'd sacrificed himself for his country, or even the broken warrior too damaged to return home. This was a man who'd chosen the easier path of starting over, rather than fighting to reclaim the life he'd built with us. The selfishness of it took my breath away. He used forged documents to travel through Europe, Mom said, consulting notes she'd apparently taken during their conversation. Spent several months in Ireland working on farms, paying cash for everything, and avoiding any situation that might require official identification. When he felt confident in his new identity, he made his way to Australia and began the process of building the life he described in his letter. The methodical nature of Dad's deception was staggering. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision made in the confusion of injury and trauma. It was a carefully planned escape that required months of preparation and execution. But what about Catherine? I asked, thinking of the blonde woman in the photos Mom had found. When did he meet her? Mom's expression grew even colder, if such a thing were possible. Catherine Miller was a nurse at the military hospital in Germany. She was part of the team treating your father's injuries, specifically assigned to help him work through his memory issues and emotional trauma. Their relationship began while he was still officially listed as dead, while she was still professionally obligated to help him process his grief over the family he'd supposedly lost. The revelation added layers of betrayal that made my head spin. Dad hadn't just abandoned us for a new life, he'd begun building that new life while being treated for the trauma of losing us. The woman who became his wife had helped him grieve for the family he was actively choosing to abandon. She knew about us, I whispered, though I was afraid of the answer. She knew everything, Mom confirmed, her words falling like hammer blows. Your father told her about his wife and daughter in Iowa, about the farm he'd worked, about the life he was afraid to return to because he felt too damaged to be the man we remembered. Catherine encouraged him to contact us, to at least let us know he was alive. But when the time came to make that choice, he convinced her that disappearing would be kinder to everyone involved. The manipulation was breathtaking in its scope. Dad had used his own trauma as justification for inflicting greater trauma on us, convincing both himself and Catherine that letting us believe him dead was somehow merciful. So she helped him disappear, I said, the pieces of the puzzle finally forming a complete picture. She helped him fake his own death within the hospital system, Mom said, her voice taking on the flat quality of someone reciting facts too painful to process emotionally. Catherine falsified medical records to make it appear that your father had died from complications of his injuries. She arranged for his body to be listed as destroyed in a hospital fire that actually happened but claimed no casualties. By the time the paperwork reached the United States, the official story of his death in Afghanistan had been supplemented with a second death in Germany, making his survival seem impossible even if questions arose. The professional nature of the deception made it feel even more calculated and cruel. This wasn't a desperate man making poor choices in the heat of trauma. This was a conspiracy involving medical professionals who should have been helping Dad heal, instead of helping him disappear. How did you get him to tell you all this? I asked, wondering what kind of pressure Mom had applied to extract such detailed confessions. Mom's smile was predatory, revealing a side of her personality I'd never suspected existed. I told him that I'd already hired a private investigator to verify the details in his letter, that I'd learned enough about his real timeline to know he was lying about significant parts of his story. I suggested that he could either tell me the truth voluntarily, or I could continue my investigation and discover it myself, along with whatever other secrets he might be hiding. The bluff had apparently worked perfectly, triggering a confession that revealed the full scope of Dad's betrayal. But as Mom continued her account of their confrontation, I began to understand that she hadn't been bluffing at all. During the week between Dad's letter and their meeting, she'd actually contacted a private investigator specializing in military records, someone who'd helped her piece together enough of the real story to know that Dad's version contained significant omissions and distortions. "There's more," Mom said, and I braced myself for revelations that could hardly be worse than what she'd already shared. "Catherine is pregnant again. Their second child is due in December, which means she conceived while your father was writing us that letter about wanting to reconnect with his American family. He's been planning to return to Iowa not because he missed us or felt guilty about his deception, but because he needs money." The final piece of Dad's puzzle clicked into place with devastating clarity. "The cattle operation," I said, remembering his mention of importing genetics for his Australian business. "He's not successful over there." "He's failing," Mom confirmed. "The station where he works is being sold, and he'll lose his job within 6 months. Catherine's medical benefits don't extend to family members who aren't Australian citizens, and he can't afford the healthcare costs for 2 children without employment. He was hoping to convince us to sell the farm and give him his share of the proceeds so he could start over somewhere else." The audacity of Dad's plan was stunning. He'd abandoned us to build a new life, lied about the circumstances of his survival, created an elaborate deception to fake his own death, and now wanted to return just long enough to claim half of everything Mom had worked to preserve during his absence. The farm that represented generations of family history, the land he'd supposedly died defending, was nothing more than a financial asset he hoped to liquidate for his convenience. The kitchen fell silent except for the steady tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway, the same timepiece that had marked the hours during Dad's deployment, during the notification of his death, during the 2 years we'd spent learning to live without him. Now its measured rhythm seemed to underscore the magnitude of his betrayal, each second representing another moment of grief he'd allowed us to endure, while building his new life halfway around the world. "He brought paperwork," Mom said, reaching into her purse to extract a manila folder I hadn't noticed before. Legal documents he'd had prepared by an attorney in Brisbane, papers designed to establish his claim to half the farm's value despite being legally dead for 2 years. He'd researched Iowa property law, discovered that his death certificate could be overturned with sufficient evidence of fraud, and calculated exactly how much money he'd need to solve his problems in Australia. She spread the documents across our kitchen table like evidence in a criminal trial, pages of legal terminology that reduced our family's 22-year marriage to a series of asset valuations and property divisions. The farm that had been in Mom's family for 3 generations was itemized and appraised, its worth broken down into land values, equipment costs, and livestock assessments. Even our house, the place where I'd been born and raised, was listed as a divisible marital asset subject to equitable distribution. "He'd thought of everything," Mom continued, her voice carrying a mixture of admiration and disgust. "The timing of his approach, the emotional manipulation of his letter, even the location of our meeting in Chicago where Illinois law would govern any agreements we might reach. He'd consulted attorneys in 3 different states to determine the most advantageous jurisdiction for filing his claim. The calculated nature of Dad's return made every word in his letter seem like strategic manipulation, rather than genuine emotion. His expressions of love and regret weren't heartfelt confessions, but tactical moves designed to soften our resistance to his financial demands. Even his mention of wanting to see me again was revealed as emotional leverage, a way to pressure Mom into compliance by threatening to take away her daughter's relationship with her supposedly reformed father. "What did you tell him?" I asked, though part of me was afraid to hear Mom's response. The woman sitting across from me bore little resemblance to the gentle teacher and farmer's wife I'd known my entire life. 2 years of grief had changed her in ways I was only beginning to understand, creating reserves of strength and ruthlessness that perhaps had always existed but never been tested. Mom's smile was arctic, beautiful and terrifying in its perfect coldness. I told him that I understood his situation completely, that I sympathized with his financial difficulties and his concern for his growing family in Australia, I expressed appreciation for his honesty about the circumstances of his survival and his reasons for staying away. I even complimented him on the thoroughness of his legal research and the cleverness of his approach. The response seemed entirely too reasonable given what Dad had revealed about his deception and current motivations. I'd expected anger, accusations, demands for explanations that went beyond money and legal technicalities. Instead, Mom had apparently responded with the kind of gracious understanding that was completely out of character for the situation. And then, I prompted, sensing there was more to the story than Mom's initial summary suggested. And then I told him about the changes we'd made to the farm since his death, Mom said, her tone shifting to something that sounded almost conversational. About the new equipment we'd purchased with the life insurance money, the improvements we'd made to the irrigation system, the additional land we'd leased from the Henderson family when they decided to retire. I explained how the operation had grown during his absence, how we'd diversified into organic certification and direct-to-consumer sales. The direction of the conversation confused me, since I wasn't aware of any significant changes to our farming operation beyond the normal maintenance and seasonal adjustments. We'd used Dad's life insurance money to pay off existing debts and establish a modest savings account, but there hadn't been major capital investments or expansion projects. If anything, we'd scaled back our operation to match what Mom and I could manage without Dad's labor and expertise. I showed him our new partnership agreement, Mom continued, producing another set of documents from her folder. The legal papers we'd filed last month established Mitchell Family Farms as a limited liability company with specific ownership structures and operational guidelines. Very interesting reading, particularly the sections dealing with membership requirements and voting rights. My confusion deepened as I tried to understand what Mom was describing. We hadn't formed any business partnership or filed incorporation papers that I knew about. The farm was still owned individually by Mom as Dad's surviving spouse, just as it had been since the settlement of his estate 2 years earlier, unless Mom had been making legal arrangements without telling me, which seemed completely out of character for someone who'd always included me in every important decision about our family's future. The most fascinating aspect of the partnership structure, Mom said, her voice taking on the lecturing tone she used when explaining complex concepts to her second-grade students, is the clause requiring unanimous consent from all partners for any sale or division of company assets. Since the partnership includes not only living members but also memorial shares held in trust for deceased partners who died in service to their country, achieving unanimous consent becomes quite challenging. The light began to dawn as I realized what Mom was describing. She'd created a legal fiction designed to protect the farm from Dad's claim, a business structure that made it impossible for him to force a sale or demand his share of the property value. By establishing Dad's death in service as a memorial partnership share, she'd effectively frozen his interest in the farm while maintaining her own control over its operation. Of course, Mom continued with the casual tone of someone discussing the weather, the partnership agreement also includes specific provisions for dealing with fraud, particularly situations where deceased partners are discovered to have fabricated their own deaths for personal gain. Very serious business. Insurance fraud and falsifying death certificates. Federal crimes, actually, with substantial penalties, including forfeiture of any claims to the fraudulently obtained assets. The trap Mom had constructed was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its implications. Dad's attempt to claim his share of the farm would require him to admit that he'd participated in insurance fraud and falsified government documents, crimes that would not only void his financial claim but potentially result in criminal prosecution. His choice was stark: walk away empty-handed or risk federal prison for the money he needed to support his Australian family. How did he react? I asked, beginning to appreciate the full scope of Mom's strategic thinking. She'd spent the week before their meeting not just researching Dad's lies, but constructing a legal framework that would protect us from his financial demands while exposing him to consequences for his deception. He asked for time to consider his options, Mom said, gathering the documents back into her folder. I gave him 24 hours to decide whether he wanted to pursue his claim through the courts, knowing what the legal discovery process would reveal about his activities since leaving Germany. I also suggested he might want to consult with his Australian attorney about the extradition implications of federal fraud charges filed in the United States. The ultimatum was masterfully crafted, giving Dad just enough rope to hang himself, while making the consequences of his choices crystal clear. Mom had turned his own legal research against him, using his knowledge of property law to demonstrate how the same courts he'd hoped to use for financial gain could instead be used to prosecute him for fraud. "There's one more thing," Mom said, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than her earlier declarations. "I told him that Sarah would be 18 next month, old enough to make her own decisions about whether she wanted a relationship with a father who'd let her grieve his death while building a new family with another woman. I suggested that any attempt to contact you directly, any effort to manipulate your emotions or pressure you into supporting his financial claims, would result in immediate filing of fraud charges with the FBI. The protection she'd placed around me was both touching and terrifying, a mother's fierce love expressed through legal threats and strategic maneuvering. Mom had anticipated that Dad might try to use my desire to reconnect with him as leverage against her, and she'd preemptively neutralized that possibility by making clear that such manipulation would trigger immediate consequences. "So what happens now?" I asked, though I suspected Mom had already planned several moves ahead in this chess game she was playing with Dad's freedom and future. Mom's smile was sharp enough to cut diamonds, beautiful and dangerous in the afternoon light filtering through our kitchen windows. "Now we wait for your father to call back with his decision, though I suspect we already know what that decision will be." Dad's call came exactly 23 hours and 47 minutes after Mom's ultimatum, 13 minutes before her deadline expired. I was in the barn feeding the cattle when I heard the phone ringing through the open kitchen window, its urgent tone cutting through the evening air like a distress signal. By the time I reached the house, Mom had already answered, her voice carrying the controlled politeness she reserved for difficult conversations with school administrators or insurance adjusters. "Good evening, Michael," she said, and the use of his full name instead of the casual Mick that had once been natural between them spoke volumes about how fundamentally their relationship had changed. "I assume you're calling to discuss your decision regarding our conversation yesterday." The formality was deliberate, creating distance that made clear this was a business transaction rather than a personal reconciliation. I positioned myself at the kitchen table where I could hear both sides of the conversation, Mom having put the call on speakerphone with a gesture that suggested she wanted me to witness whatever came next. Dad's voice sounded hollow through the electronic connection, stripped of the confidence and charm that had once made him the kind of man people naturally followed into difficult situations. "Rebecca, I need you to understand that I never meant for things to go this far," he began, his words carrying the weight of someone who'd spent sleepless hours rehearsing this conversation. "When I first decided to stay away, I thought I was protecting you and Sarah from seeing me broken. I thought letting you grieve and move on would be kinder than bringing home a man who wasn't the husband and father you remembered." Mom's expression didn't change as she listened to Dad's explanation, her face maintaining the neutral mask she'd perfected during years of parent-teacher conferences with difficult families. "And when did that noble intention transform into insurance fraud and falsifying death certificates?" she asked, her tone suggesting she was genuinely curious about the psychological progression, rather than seeking to shame him. The question hung in the air for several seconds before Dad responded, his voice cracking slightly as he tried to maintain composure. "It happened gradually, Rebecca. Catherine was helping me work through the trauma, and somewhere along the way, our professional relationship became personal. By the time I realized I was falling in love with her, I'd already been officially dead for over a year. Coming back would have meant explaining not just my survival but my relationship with her. The fact that I'd moved on while you were still grieving. The explanation revealed layers of cowardice that went beyond simple fear of emotional confrontation. Dad hadn't just been afraid of returning home damaged. He'd been afraid of facing the consequences of the choices he'd made while supposedly dead. Each decision had led to another, creating a web of deception that eventually became too complex to untangle without destroying multiple lives. "So you decided the solution was to take half the farm and disappear again," Mom said, stating the obvious conclusion with clinical detachment. "Use the money to establish yourself permanently in Australia, where you could continue your new life without the inconvenience of explaining your past to anyone who might ask uncomfortable questions." Dad's breathing was audible through the phone connection, ragged inhalations that suggested he was struggling to maintain control of his emotions. "I know how it sounds, Rebecca. I know what you think of me now, and I don't blame you for any of it. But I have children to think about, a wife who's pregnant and depending on me to provide for our family. I can't just abandon them the way I abandoned you." The irony of Dad expressing concern about abandoning his Australian family while having literally abandoned his American family was apparently lost on him. His moral reasoning had become so twisted that he could simultaneously acknowledge the wrongness of abandonment while planning to commit the same act again for financial gain. Mom leaned back in her chair, studying the phone as if she could see Dad's face through the electronic connection. "Tell me about Emily," she said, referencing Dad's daughter with Catherine. "How old did you say she was in your letter? 6 months?" The question seemed to come from nowhere, unrelated to the discussion of legal consequences and financial demands. "She's 8 months now," Dad replied, confusion evident in his voice. "Rebecca, I don't understand what Emily has to do with our situation. She's just a baby, she doesn't know anything about my past or the complications with your farm." Mom's smile was predatory, the expression of someone who'd just confirmed a crucial piece of information. 8 months old, she repeated thoughtfully. "Which means Catherine became pregnant approximately 17 months ago, just a few weeks after you supposedly escaped from insurgent captivity and were struggling with severe trauma that prevented you from contacting your family." The mathematics of the timeline created implications that hung in the air, like toxic gas, poisoning whatever remained of Dad's credibility. If Emily was 8 months old, then Catherine had conceived her while Dad was still supposedly too psychologically damaged to handle the stress of reuniting with his original family. The pregnancy had begun before he'd even attempted to justify his extended absence, revealing that his new life hadn't been a gradual development, but an immediate replacement for the family he'd left behind. Dad's silence stretched for nearly a minute before he finally responded, his voice barely above a whisper. "Rebecca, please don't make this more complicated than it already is. Yes, Catherine and I began our relationship while I was still officially dead, but that doesn't change the fact that I need help now. I'm asking you to be generous, to remember that we once loved each other enough to build a life together." The appeal to their former relationship was strategically timed but emotionally tone-deaf, revealing how little Dad understood about the depth of Mom's transformation during his absence. The woman who'd once been willing to forgive his deployment-related mood swings and emotional distance had been replaced by someone who'd learned to survive without him, someone who'd discovered reserves of strength she'd never known she possessed. "I do remember our life together, Michael," Mom said, her voice taking on a reminiscent quality that might have been mistaken for nostalgia by someone who didn't know her well. "I remember how you used to say that integrity was non-negotiable, that a man's word was the only thing he truly owned. I remember your lectures about responsibility and duty, about how real men face their problems instead of running away from them." The references to Dad's own philosophical statements created a mirror that reflected his current actions against his former principles, highlighting the gap between the man he'd once been and the person he'd become. Mom was using his own moral framework to condemn his choices, making his hypocrisy impossible to ignore or rationalize. "I remember how proud you were of your military service," she continued, her tone remaining conversational, despite the devastating content of her words. "How you used to tell Sarah that soldiers never left their brothers behind, that honor meant keeping faith with the people who depended on you. I'm curious about how those principles apply to falsifying military death records and defrauding the Department of Veterans Affairs." The mention of veterans fraud added another dimension to Dad's legal exposure, expanding the potential consequences beyond simple insurance issues to include federal agencies that took military honor seriously. Mom had apparently researched not just the immediate implications of Dad's deception, but the broader legal framework that governed his actions as a service member. Dad's response came in the form of a long exhale that sounded like air escaping from a punctured tire. "What do you want from me, Rebecca? What would it take for you to help me, without involving lawyers and federal investigators? I'll sign whatever papers you want, agree to whatever terms you think are fair. Just tell me what you need to make this work." The desperation in his voice was palpable, the sound of someone who'd finally realized that his carefully constructed plan had no chance of success. But Mom's expression suggested she'd been waiting for exactly this moment. the point where Dad would abandon his demands and begin negotiating from a position of weakness. "I want you to understand something very clearly, Michael," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent 2 years learning to make decisions without consulting anyone else. "This conversation isn't a negotiation. You don't have anything I want, and you're not in a position to make demands or offers. You're gonna listen to what I tell you, and then you're gonna decide whether you want to walk away quietly or spend the next several years in federal prison." The silence that followed Mom's declaration stretched so long I began to wonder if the phone connection had been lost. When Dad finally spoke, his voice carried a tremor I'd never heard before, the sound of a man who'd finally grasped that he was completely powerless in a situation he'd expected to control. "I'm listening," he said, the words barely audible through the speaker. Gone was any pretense of negotiation or appeal to shared history. This was unconditional surrender, delivered by someone who'd run out of options and excuses. Mom stood and walked to the kitchen window, looking out at the farm. Dad had once worked with such pride, land that represented 4 generations of family history he'd been willing to liquidate for his personal convenience. When she turned back to face the phone, her expression held the kind of cold satisfaction that comes from holding absolute power over someone who'd caused immeasurable pain. "You're going to return to Australia and resume your life with Catherine and your children," she began, her voice carrying the measured cadence of someone reading terms of surrender. "You will never again contact anyone in Cedar Falls, Iowa, including Sarah, your former neighbors, or any member of your extended family. You will not attempt to claim any portion of the farm, the house, or any assets that were part of our marriage." The terms were harsh but not unexpected, given the scope of Dad's deception and the legal vulnerability his actions had created. But as Mom continued outlining her demands, it became clear that her conditions went far beyond simple financial protection. "You will sign legal documents permanently relinquishing any claim to Sarah's inheritance, her college fund, and her future relationship with you," Mom continued, each word delivered with surgical precision. "She will be free to contact you when and if she chooses, but you will not initiate any communication with her until she reaches the age of 25. If she decides she never wants to see you again, you will respect that decision without question or appeal." The 7-year waiting period seemed arbitrary, until I realized its significance. By the time I turned 25, I would be a fully independent adult, with my own career and life experiences. Someone mature enough to evaluate Dad's choices without the emotional vulnerability of an 18-year-old who still desperately wanted her father's love, despite his betrayals. "Furthermore," Mom said, returning to her chair with the deliberate movements of someone savoring a moment of absolute control, "you will undergo psychological evaluation and treatment for whatever disorders led you to believe that abandoning your family was an acceptable solution to your problems. You will provide documentation of this treatment to a therapist of my choosing, who will monitor your progress and ensure you're addressing the underlying issues that created this situation." The requirement for mental health treatment struck me as particularly cruel, since Dad's original fear of seeming weak or damaged had been one of his justifications for staying away. Now Mom was making his psychological healing a condition of avoiding prosecution, forcing him to confront the very vulnerabilities he'd been trying to escape. Dad's voice cracked when he finally responded, "Rebecca, please. I understand about the money and the farm. I accept that I have no right to those things. But Sarah is my daughter. Don't punish her for my mistakes by keeping us apart. She deserves the chance to know her father, even if I've made terrible choices." The appeal was emotionally manipulative in exactly the way Mom had predicted, using my supposed needs as leverage to soften her position. But the woman who'd spent 2 years rebuilding her life from the ashes of his supposed death was immune to such tactics, particularly when they came from someone who'd already proven his willingness to prioritize his own comfort over his family's well-being. "Sarah has known her father," Mom replied, her tone suggesting she was correcting a factual error rather than addressing an emotional plea. "She knew the man who taught her to drive a tractor, who built her a tire swing, who called every Tuesday and Friday during his deployment. That man died in Afghanistan, just as the military reported. You are someone else entirely, someone who shares his face and voice but lacks his character and integrity." The distinction she drew between the father I'd loved and the man on the phone was devastating in its accuracy. The dad who'd raised me would never have abandoned his family to avoid difficult conversations, would never have falsified death records for financial gain, would never have used his daughter's emotions as bargaining chips in a legal negotiation. That man had died somewhere between Germany and Australia, replaced by a stranger who wore his identity like an ill-fitting costume. As for punishment, Mom continued, Sarah has already been punished quite enough by your choices. She spent 2 years grieving a father who was building a new family with another woman. She's struggling with guilt about not being enough to make you want to come home, wondering what she could have done differently to prevent your death. The cruelest thing I could do to her now would be to expose her to more of your selfishness and manipulation. The protection Mom was placing around me felt both necessary and suffocating, a mother's fierce love expressed through legal barriers that would prevent further emotional damage. Part of me wanted to rebel against her decision, to demand the right to make my own choices about a relationship with Dad, but a larger part of me recognized the wisdom in her conditions, understanding that the man on the phone was not someone I could trust with my emotional welfare. There's one final condition, Mom said, and her tone suggested this was the most important requirement of all. You will write a letter to the families of the 2 soldiers who actually died in the explosion that you survived. You will explain how your decision to fake your own death has dishonored their real sacrifice, and you will ask their forgiveness for allowing your cowardice to diminish the meaning of their courage. The requirement was brilliant in its cruelty, forcing Dad to confront the broader implications of his deception beyond its impact on our family. By falsifying his death, he'd not only betrayed his wife and daughter, but also disrespected the memory of genuine heroes who'd given their lives in service to their country. The letters would force him to acknowledge that his survival carried obligations he'd chosen to ignore. Dad's response came in the form of choked breathing that might have been tears, though the phone connection made it impossible to determine whether his emotion was genuine remorse or simple self-pity. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet I had to strain to hear him. How long do I have to decide? He asked, though we all knew his decision had already been made. The alternative to accepting Mom's conditions was federal prosecution for fraud, a risk that no rational person would take when faced with the evidence she'd accumulated. You don't have time to decide, Mom replied, consulting the kitchen clock as if she were monitoring a countdown timer. You have time to comply. I want to sign legal documents accepting these conditions delivered to my attorney within 48 hours. I want documentation of your first therapy appointment within 2 weeks. I want the letters to the soldiers' families postmarked within 1 month. The timeline was aggressive but achievable, designed to prevent Dad from developing second thoughts or attempting to negotiate alternative arrangements. Mom had learned from his previous disappearance that giving him too much time to think led to elaborate schemes and further deception. And if I refuse? Dad asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Mom's smile was visible in her voice when she responded. Then I make a phone call to the FBI field office in Des Moines, and you spend Emily's childhood in federal prison while Catherine raises your children as a single mother. Your choice, Michael, but choose quickly, because my patience for this conversation is approaching its limit. The ultimatum was delivered with the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence, leaving no room for appeal or negotiation. Dad had been outmaneuvered by someone he'd underestimated, defeated by the very woman he'd assumed would be too grief-stricken and dependent to mount effective resistance to his demands. When the call ended 5 minutes later with Dad's reluctant agreement to Mom's terms, I found myself looking at her with new eyes, seeing not just the gentle teacher and farmer's wife I'd always known, but a strategist capable of protecting what mattered most through whatever means necessary. The legal documents arrived by overnight courier exactly 47 hours after Dad's phone call, thick manila envelopes bearing the letterhead of a prestigious Brisbane law firm that specialized in international family law. Mom spread the papers across our dining room table like a general reviewing battle plans, her reading glasses perched on her nose as she examined every clause and provision with the attention to detail she usually reserved for grading her students' math assignments. The documents were comprehensive beyond anything I'd expected, clearly drafted by attorneys who understood the complexity of Dad's situation and the potential consequences of non-compliance. His signature appeared on page after page of legal language that stripped away any remaining connection between him and the life he'd built in Iowa, transforming our family relationships into contractual obligations with specific penalties for violation. He's agreed to everything, Mom said, her voice carrying a mixture of satisfaction and something that might have been disappointment. Perhaps part of her had hoped Dad would refuse her terms, giving her the opportunity to follow through on her threat to involve federal investigators. The peaceful resolution denied her the chance to see him face criminal consequences for his deception. The relinquishment of parental rights was particularly thorough, including provisions that removed Dad's name from my emergency contact forms, medical decision-making authority, and any claim to involvement in my education or future planning. Legally, he would become a stranger to me, someone with no more rights or responsibilities than any random person I might encounter on the street. Most surprising was the financial component of the agreement, terms that went beyond simple asset protection to include punitive measures designed to ensure Dad's compliance with the other conditions. He'd agreed to pay child support retroactively for the 2 years he'd been supposedly dead, calculated at military pay scales, and including interest penalties that reflected the cost of his deception. The amount was substantial enough to impact his ability to establish himself financially in Australia, ensuring that his choices would have lasting consequences. The therapy requirement is interesting, Mom observed, pointing to a section that outlined Dad's obligations for psychological treatment. He's agreed to work with a specialist in moral injury and military trauma, someone who deals specifically with veterans who've made choices that conflict with their core values. The treatment plan includes family therapy sessions via video conference, though those won't begin until you turn 21, and only if you choose to participate. The prospect of someday sitting in a therapist's office trying to rebuild a relationship with Dad felt both appealing and terrifying. Part of me wanted the chance to understand what had driven him to make such destructive choices, to find some way to reconcile the loving father I remembered with the calculating stranger who'd tried to claim half our farm. But another part of me wondered whether some betrayals were too fundamental to overcome, whether forgiveness was even possible for someone who'd caused such comprehensive damage to our family. The letters to the soldiers' families had been written and mailed as required, though Mom's attorney had insisted on reviewing copies before they were sent. Dad's words were formal and stilted, acknowledging his deception and expressing regret for any pain his actions might have caused their survivors. The letters avoided specific details about his fake death or current circumstances, focusing instead on general themes of responsibility and honor that felt hollow given the context of their composition. 1 week after the documents were signed, the first therapy report arrived from Dr. Amanda Chen, a psychologist in Brisbane who specialized in treating veterans with complex trauma histories. Her initial assessment of Dad painted a picture of someone struggling with severe identity fragmentation, unable to reconcile his pre-deployment self with the person he'd become after his injuries. The clinical language made his choices seem more like symptoms of mental illness than deliberate moral failures, though it didn't excuse the harm he'd caused to everyone who'd believed him dead. Dissociative episodes related to traumatic brain injury, Mom read from the report, her voice taking on the analytical tone she used when reviewing challenging cases with school counselors. Inability to process conflicting identity states, leading to compartmentalization of emotional attachments. It's fascinating from a psychological perspective, but it doesn't change what he put us through. The medical explanation for Dad's behavior felt both illuminating and inadequate, offering insight into his mental state without providing comfort for those who'd suffered the consequences of his choices. Understanding that his brain injury had contributed to his decision-making failures didn't erase the 2 years we'd spent grieving his supposed death, or the betrayal we'd felt upon learning he'd built a new family while we mourned his loss. Life at the farm gradually returned to something resembling normal, though normal had been redefined by everything we'd experienced since Dad's resurrection and subsequent banishment. Mom threw herself into her advocacy work with military families, using her experience with Dad's deception to help other survivors navigate the complex bureaucracy of veteran benefits and casualty notifications. Her transformation from grieving widow to fierce advocate was remarkable to witness, revealing capabilities that perhaps had always existed but never been tested by circumstances. I finished my senior year with renewed focus, motivated partly by the desire to build a life independent of Dad's influence, and partly by the realization that my education represented the best path toward understanding the complex world beyond our rural community. The full scholarship I'd earned to the University of Iowa felt like validation of everything Mom had sacrificed to keep me focused on my future, rather than trapped by our family's traumatic past. Graduation day arrived with unexpected emotional complexity, a celebration of achievement shadowed by the absence of someone who should have been there to witness it. The empty chair where Dad would have sat felt different now that I knew he was alive somewhere, probably seeing photos of the ceremony on social media but legally prohibited from contacting me to offer congratulations or encouragement. The finality of our separation felt both necessary and heartbreaking. Mom gave the commencement address as the school district's Teacher of the Year, speaking about resilience and the importance of facing challenges with integrity, rather than seeking easier paths that compromised one's values. Her words carried personal weight that most of the audience couldn't fully appreciate. Lessons learned through bitter experience with someone who'd chosen convenience over character when tested by difficult circumstances. Summer passed quietly, filled with farm work and preparation for college that felt both exciting and melancholy. The house would be different with just Mom living there, managing the operation we'd maintained together since Dad's supposed death. She'd hired Tommy Brennan full-time to handle the physical labor, but the emotional partnership that had sustained us through the hardest period of our lives would necessarily change as I began building my own independent existence. The night before I left for Iowa City, Mom and I sat on the front porch swing Dad had built during my childhood, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded me of happier times when our family had been complete and uncomplicated. The swing creaked gently as we rocked, its familiar rhythm providing comfort that transcended the painful associations with its creator. "Do you think you'll ever want to see him again?" Mom asked, her voice carrying genuine curiosity rather than judgment about whatever answer I might give. The question had haunted me since Dad's banishment, creating internal conflicts between my desire for closure and my fear of further disappointment. "I don't know," I admitted, watching barn swallows dive for insects in the evening air. "Part of me wants to understand what happened to him, why he made the choices he did. But another part of me thinks some questions don't have good answers, that knowing more might just make everything hurt worse." Mom nodded thoughtfully, her expression suggesting she'd wrestled with similar conflicts about forgiveness and understanding. "The therapy reports might help with that eventually," she said. "Dr. Chen thinks he's making progress toward accepting responsibility for his actions rather than just explaining them away as symptoms of his injuries." The possibility that Dad might someday become someone worthy of forgiveness felt both hopeful and distant, a future that depended on changes he might never achieve. But the legal framework Mom had created ensured that any reconciliation would happen on my terms, when I was mature enough to protect myself from further emotional manipulation. As stars began appearing in the darkening sky, I realized that Dad's betrayal had taught me something valuable about the difference between love and dependency, between family bonds based on genuine affection and those sustained by habit or obligation. The love I'd felt for the father of my childhood was real and would always be part of me, but it didn't require me to accept treatment from someone who'd proven himself unworthy of that precious gift. College transformed me in ways I hadn't anticipated, expanding my understanding of the world beyond the boundaries of rural Iowa, and introducing me to people whose family experiences made my own complicated history seem almost ordinary. My roommate Jennifer had been raised by her grandmother after both parents died in a car accident when she was 12. Marcus, who lived down the hall, had been adopted from foster care at age 16 by a family that gave him stability he'd never known. Sarah, from my psychology class, had never met her father, who'd abandoned her mother before she was born. These conversations about family dysfunction and resilience helped me understand that betrayal and loss were universal human experiences, that my particular brand of father-related trauma was neither unique nor insurmountable. The academic environment at the University of Iowa provided intellectual frameworks for analyzing family systems, attachment theory, and the psychological impact of parental abandonment that made Dad's choices feel less personal and more like case studies in human behavior under stress. My major in social work with a concentration in military family services emerged naturally from my own experiences with Dad's deception and Mom's subsequent advocacy work. The coursework was challenging but deeply relevant, covering topics like moral injury in combat veterans, the impact of PTSD on family relationships, and the complex process of rebuilding trust after betrayal. Professors who learned about my background often used my family's story as teaching examples, helping other students understand how military service could create psychological wounds that affected entire families for years. During my sophomore year, I received my first communication from Dad since his banishment, though it came indirectly through Dr. Chen's quarterly progress reports that Mom's attorney forwarded to us as required by their legal agreement. The clinical language couldn't entirely hide the human story beneath the psychological terminology, describing someone who is slowly learning to accept responsibility for his choices rather than rationalizing them as inevitable consequences of his injuries. The patient demonstrates increased awareness of the impact his decisions had on family members, Dr. Chen wrote in one report. He has begun processing grief related to the loss of his original family relationships, acknowledging that this loss was self-inflicted rather than imposed by external circumstances. Progress toward accepting full responsibility continues, though the patient still occasionally reverts to explanatory frameworks that minimize his agency in creating the current situation. The reports painted a picture of gradual psychological healing that felt both encouraging and irrelevant to my daily life. Dad was apparently becoming a better person through therapy, but that improvement didn't erase the 2 years Mom and I had spent believing him dead, or the calculated way he'd tried to claim half our farm when his Australian life became financially unstable. Personal growth was admirable, but it didn't automatically restore trust or repair relationships that had been damaged beyond simple forgiveness. My junior year brought unexpected news that shifted my perspective on Dad's situation in ways I hadn't anticipated. Mom called on a Tuesday evening in March, her voice carrying excitement that seemed inappropriate given the serious tone our family conversations had taken since Dad's resurrection. She'd received a letter from Catherine in Australia, written without Dad's knowledge, and mailed to our farm address that she'd apparently found among his personal papers. Catherine's letter was remarkable for its honesty and the insight it provided into Dad's life since leaving Iowa. She wrote about the guilt she'd carried since learning the full truth about his family situation, the realization that her relationship with him had been built on a foundation of lies and abandoned obligations. More importantly, she described the man she'd fallen in love with as someone fundamentally different from the person he'd revealed himself to be once their relationship became permanent. Michael presented himself as someone who'd lost everything to war, Catherine wrote in careful handwriting that suggested English wasn't her first language. He said his wife and daughter had died in an accident while he was deployed, that he was alone in the world with no family or connections to anchor him anywhere. I believed I was helping a broken man heal from unimaginable loss, not enabling someone to abandon responsibilities he was afraid to face. The revelation that Dad had lied to Catherine about our deaths added another layer to his deception, demonstrating that his pattern of avoiding difficult truths extended beyond his original family to the new relationships he'd built. Catherine had loved someone who didn't really exist, a fictional version of Dad that excluded inconvenient details about his actual character and obligations. Her letter suggested that she was beginning to understand the scope of his deception and its implications for their future together. Emily asks about her grandparents sometimes, Catherine continued, referring to Dad's daughter, who was now 3 years old and beginning to understand family relationships. Michael tells her that his parents died before she was born, that she has no extended family because everyone he loved is gone. I know now that she has a sister in America, that there are people who share her blood but don't know she exists. This knowledge breaks my heart. The idea that I had a half-sister who'd been told I was dead created a mirror image of my own experience, another child being raised on lies about her family history. Emily was growing up believing herself isolated and alone when she actually had relatives who would love her if they were given the chance. Dad's pattern of using death as a solution to inconvenient relationships had expanded to include his new family, creating multiple victims of his inability to integrate the different aspects of his life. Catherine's letter concluded with a request that surprised me with its directness and emotional honesty. She wanted to establish contact between our families independent of Dad's wishes, to ensure that Emily grew up knowing the truth about her American relatives, even if direct communication wasn't possible. She'd included photos of Emily and their new baby son Thomas, along with her email address and phone number in Brisbane. Looking at pictures of Emily was like seeing myself at that age, the same stubborn chin and green eyes that marked her unmistakably as Dad's daughter. Thomas had been born the previous December, making him the second child Dad had conceived while supposedly working toward reconciliation with his original family. The timing revealed that his financial desperation during our Chicago meeting had been driven by the reality of supporting 4 people on an Australian cattle station worker's salary. Mom's response to Catherine's letter demonstrated the same strategic thinking she'd used to neutralize Dad's financial claims, but with a gentleness that acknowledged Catherine and the children as fellow victims, rather than complicit partners in his deception. She wrote back immediately, expressing sympathy for Catherine's situation and offering to establish a relationship that would benefit the children without requiring Dad's participation or approval. The correspondence between Mom and Catherine evolved into a genuine friendship built on shared experiences with the same man's emotional limitations and dishonesty. Catherine's descriptions of Dad's behavior in Australia revealed patterns that Mom recognized from their early marriage, controlling tendencies and emotional manipulation that had been manageable when he was genuinely committed to their relationship but became destructive when his loyalty was divided between multiple families. During my senior year, Catherine made a decision that fundamentally altered Dad's Australian situation and created new possibilities for our fractured family relationships. She'd saved enough money from her nursing salary to relocate with the children to Perth, where her sister lived, and could provide support for raising Emily and Thomas as a single mother. Her letter announcing this decision was matter-of-fact about her reasons for leaving Dad, focusing on the children's need for stability and honesty, rather than dwelling on his failures as a partner. "Michael is not a bad man," Catherine wrote in her final letter from Queensland, "but he is not a whole man either. The parts of himself that he left behind in Iowa have never been replaced or healed, only covered over with new relationships that can't fill the spaces where his original connections used to be. Emily and Thomas deserve a father who is fully present in their lives, not someone who is always looking backward toward losses he created, but can't acknowledge." The insight was profound, coming from someone who'd loved Dad enough to build a life with him, but was honest enough to recognize when that life had become unsustainable. Catherine's decision to leave him created an opportunity for direct communication between our families that bypassed his control over information and relationships. For the first time since his resurrection, I had the possibility of connecting with my half-siblings without his involvement or approval. My graduation from the University of Iowa took place on a warm May afternoon, with Mom, Grandma Cooper, and, surprisingly, Catherine in attendance. She'd flown to Iowa with Emily and Thomas to witness my achievement and to establish face-to-face contact that would anchor our long-distance relationship. Meeting my half-sister for the first time was emotionally overwhelming, seeing Dad's features reflected in a child who'd been raised with completely different stories about her family history. Emily was shy initially, but curious about the American relatives she'd been told were dead, asking questions about the farm and our family traditions, with the innocent directness of a 4-year-old who hadn't yet learned that some topics were complicated for adults to discuss. Thomas, barely walking but already showing signs of the Mitchell stubborn streak, demanded attention from everyone, equally blissfully unaware of the complex relationships that had brought us together. As we sat on the front porch of the farmhouse where I'd been raised, watching Emily explore the tire swing Dad had built for me 20 years earlier, I realized that his greatest betrayal hadn't been abandoning us or lying about his death. It had been his failure to understand that love isn't diminished by being shared, that connecting his different families would have created more joy than pain if he'd been honest about his circumstances and committed to managing the complexity with integrity. The man who'd taught me that soldiers never left their brothers behind had left everyone behind when facing difficulties became inconvenient. But his children were learning different lessons about loyalty and courage from the women who'd refused to let his failures define their futures or limit their capacity for love. 3 years later, I received a phone call that changed everything. It was Dr. Chen, calling to inform me that Dad had been diagnosed with early-onset dementia, likely related to his traumatic brain injury from Afghanistan. The man who'd constructed such elaborate deceptions was losing his memory, forgetting even the lies he'd built his new life around. Catherine asked if I wanted to visit him before he forgot us completely. I flew to Perth, not for reconciliation but for closure. When I walked into the memory care facility, Dad looked at me with genuine confusion, then sudden recognition that brought tears to his eyes. "Sarah? But you're supposed to be dead," he whispered, his damaged mind finally telling him the truth his healthy brain had hidden for years. In that moment, I understood that the father I'd loved had been fighting his own broken mind all along, that the man who'd betrayed us was a stranger even to himself. I held his hand and told him about Emily and Thomas, about Mom's advocacy work, about the life we'd all built without him. He died 6 months later, peacefully, with Catherine and me taking turns reading him stories about Iowa farm life that seemed to comfort him even when he couldn't remember why. Today, Emily is 8 and visits our farm every summer. Thomas calls Mom Iowa Grandma and believes tractors are the most magical machines ever invented. We're healing in ways Dad never could, proving that sometimes the greatest gift someone can give you is the chance to become stronger without them. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to our channel. We share real stories about resilience, family, and finding strength in unexpected places. Tell us in the comments, how has your family overcome betrayal or loss? Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear. Remember, you're stronger than you know, and your pain can become someone else's hope.